So up to this point, we've just looked at a very simple story about the demand for a firm's product. And we've just considered how the quantity that we would expect to sell varies with the price that we're charging. Now, as I've mentioned before, there are some things that are kind of lying in the background here that we shouldn't forget. One of those things is really the collection of all of those other things that are going to affect the demand for our product. Could be our customers' incomes, could be their preferences might change. Things could happen in other markets. For example, competitors could change prices, or there could be changes in the prices and other events in related markets that would be important. So we have to remember that that demand curve, that line, is drawn assuming that all of those things are unchanged, that they're constant. What we're going to have to consider is what would happen to the amount that we sell at any particular price if some of those things change. We're also making the very simple assumption that firms just know what demand is. So they know that if they set a particular price, they can expect, at least on average, to sell a particular quantity over a certain period of time. Now, in practice, that is not so easy. It's easy to draw just a line on a board or on a graph, but to actually know where that demand is no easy task. Particularly, as I note here, if you are introducing a new product, you have no experience, and so it's anybody's guess as to what demand might be. You will notice as well that the demand curves that I've drawn here, and that I'm going to keep on drawing, are just straight lines. So we're just keeping our life simple by supposing that there's a linear relationship between price and quantity demanded. And from that linear relationship, we could figure out what marginal revenue looked like, and it was also a straight line. So we're just going to stick with that assumption. I'm going to refer to these things as demand curves, not demand lines, but that's really because I guess we should always keep in mind that demand is not going to be a straight line, but it's going to be some sort of nonlinear thing. Okay, well, let's consider a situation in which demand changes, like I've illustrated in the picture here. So let me just grab my laser pointer. There could be events that could happen. Suppose we start off at this demand curve, demand 1. There could be things that could happen that could cause that entire relationship between the price and the quantity demanded to shift or to change. So suppose the red arrow here represents a change in demand. I would describe that as a decrease in demand or a leftward shift in the demand curve. Well, all kinds of things could bring that about. Perhaps consumers' incomes decrease and they want to buy less of our product. Suppose competitors had lowered their price, and then at any given price, the quantity that would be demanded of our product is going to decline, and so on. You could think of other examples. Once demand had decreased like that, perhaps other events could increase demand, moving demand back towards the original demand curve. Well, I'm going to give you some exercises just to think about how demand could shift, and later on, how we might want to change our price in response to that. So the basic point here is that all of those things that we've been holding constant in the background are things that are, of course, often going to be changing, maybe changing continuously. So that means that the demand curve is going to be moving around, and we need to be aware of that. So as I say here, we need to be able to try to distinguish between shifts in the demand curve, like I've just illustrated, and movements along the demand curve. So to help illustrate that difference, we actually have some different words that we would use to describe that, as I'll explain in a minute. So I want to consider this question in the following way. Suppose we ask, what happens if the firm changes its price and it observes that the quantity that it sells also changes? The question is, has the firm learned something about what its demand curve looks like? It's changed its price, it observes a new quantity sold. Are those two combinations of price and quantity lying on the same demand curve? Well, of course, the answer is no, not necessarily. Maybe one of those things that I've been mentioning has also changed. One of those things that was lying in the background has caused the demand curve to move. And so if the demand curve shifts, then what we'd be looking at are in fact two price and quantity combinations that are actually on different demand curves. Let's consider a concrete example. Well, I'm illustrating something here, an extreme price change. Let's say we have a 50% off sale. We cut the price of our product from $50 to $25. And suppose we observe the quantity sold increasing from 80,000 per week to 200,000 per week. Can we take those two price quantity combinations and just kind of sketch out a demand curve like that? Well, as I said before, not necessarily. Maybe what's happened is that we're observing two different points on two different demand curves. So here's an example. Suppose something had happened to cause an increase in demand. At the same time, let's say that we cut our price. So if we cut our price and there hadn't been this increase in demand, which is the phrase that I'm going to use to describe a shift in the entire demand relationship. We can talk about an increase in demand, or if it goes in the other direction, a decrease in demand. Suppose that hadn't happened. Then what would have happened would have been just a change in the quantity demanded as we moved along the same demand curve. So if we cut our price, sales would have increased from 80 to, let's say, suppose that's 110 or something like that. So we would describe that as a change in the quantity demanded as a result of a change in price. But if at the same time something had happened to increase demand for our product, then not only did we cut our price, but demand for our product also increased. So this new price quantity combination lies on a different demand curve. So I'm just giving you this example to illustrate the fact that we have to be careful. We can't just assume that any change in the price that results in some change in the amount that we sell is lying on the same demand curve. And so perhaps if we went back up to the same old price, we'd be selling the same as we were selling before. That wouldn't necessarily be true. Okay, well, let's move on to consider some aspects of costs. And then we'll put things together to think about revenues and costs and then profit.